Hi, I'm Johnny from UltimatePapier-mâché.com. I want to talk to you today about mold and paper mache. It's a really big problem. It doesn't need to be a problem at all, but when it is a problem, it pretty much destroys the sculpture. We put so much time and energy into a paper mache sculpture. To have it just eaten away by this green fuzzy stuff is just pretty disappointing. But on the other hand, you can go out to eBay or into an antique store and you can find paper mache pieces that were sculpted like 100 years ago, and they're doing just fine. So why do some things get moldy when other things don't, and they're both made out of the same material? The reason, I think, is that we sometimes forget what it is that mold needs. We get in our mind that that paper mache gets moldy because it's made out of flour, and mold likes flour. I mean, that's true. Mold also likes cotton, which you know if you've ever had a teenage kid throw a wet towel under the bed and kind of leave it there under a gym bag or something for a couple of weeks, mold likes cotton. There is a kind of fungus out there somewhere that will eat anything as long as there's water, and that's the real key to it. I don't put any salt, I don't put any oil of clove or any of those things into my paper mache paste. I don't do any of those things either when I make paper mache clay. But I do pay really, really close attention to getting things dry really, really fast. And that, I think, is probably why I don't have any problem with mold on my paper mache sculptures. You can, well, okay, there's another thing too. I usually use maybe 3 or 4 layers of paper strips and paste on a sculpture. Or when I'm using my paper mache clay, I'll spread it on with a knife, maybe 1/8 of an inch or even less thick. Really, really thin layers. When you have something that's that thin, the air can get to it and the water can be absorbed out into the air, and it can dry really quickly, especially if you put it in front of a fan or over a furnace vent in the wintertime. Maybe you can put it outside in the shade in the summertime so that the breeze can go by and kind of pull the water out of it. If the piece dries really quickly, then mold just simply doesn't have time to get started. There's mold spores everywhere. There's mold spores in the air. There's yeast spores there. I mean, they're just there. And they're always there. There's more of them in some areas because it's damp all the time, but they're always there everywhere. And if they find a damp thing, those spores are going to come to life. But they won't really get a good foothold if the thing dries out again really fast. Now once you get it dry though, then you really need to paint your item if you're going to paint it. For sure you have to seal it somehow or another. Use an acrylic varnish or a polyurethane varnish from the hardware store. You can use a wax coating if you want to. Anything that will seal out the moisture from the air, because that can be a real problem too. If you have an item that has already dried out, but the air is damp, then the paper in the paper mache is going to absorb that moisture, and then that gives mold another opportunity to grow. Now, the one thing that you want to be really, really careful of, and I know this happened to one of our readers recently, is if you paint and seal a sculpture when there's still a little bit of dampness on the inside that you can't see. It's dry on the outside. It looks totally dry, but it's still damp on the inside. So you go ahead and seal it. Then the mold spores are going to find that water, and they're going to bloom. They're going to come out and stain the inside of the paint first. That's going to be the first thing. Then it's going to get kind of mushy, and eventually it's just going to kind of melt and get totally disappointing. And you put so much energy into it, you really don't want that to happen. So you really need to make sure before you seal it that it's totally, totally dry. Now, I know that some people will they'll put a lot of layers on their paper mache. I'm not really sure why. I never use more than 3 or 4 layers, but I know some people do want to. And they'll put on a layer and they'll let that layer dry, and they'll put on another layer and let it dry, and and on up. And for some people that works really well. I see a real problem though if you're just starting out and you're not really familiar with it. It's really easy to forget that the first layer, which is dry, is going to absorb all the water from the second layer. So the first layer is going to get wet again. And it's going to keep on going. And you can have 8 layers on there and every single one of them maybe is dry. You put one more layer on top and they're all going to get wet again. So if you're not really, really careful when you're doing that, to dry it every single time all the way down to the bottom, you could end up with a dry layer, a nice big dry layer on top, and that little layer of damp paper mache right at the very bottom next to the armature. And that dampness that you don't see is going to get sealed inside of your sculpture and it's going to destroy it eventually because the mold will find it. You might not know it's there, but the mold is going to know. It's going to find it. So make sure it's really, really dry. I always leave my sculptures at least 2 days after I'm pretty sure it's dry. I'll leave it for another day or two just to make sure, absolutely for sure, that it's dry before I paint it and seal it. And it really makes a difference. So what am I trying to say here, I guess? It's not about the flour. I know a lot of people think that paper mache goes bad because there's flour in it, and flour is a natural product. So is paper, by the way. Flour sits in your kitchen in a sealed bag and it doesn't mold. The problem is that you've gotten flour wet and you're leaving it wet too long. And that's what causes mold. It's all about the water, not the flour. You don't need to add anything to your paper mache paste to keep the mold from wanting to eat the flour. That's not the problem. It's all about the water. So, now I know I've said that 100 times and you're getting sick of me hearing it, so I will go ahead and quit now. But just keep that in mind, I hope. If you're afraid of doing paper mache because it's going to mold, you don't need to be. Honestly, you don't. If you make sure that you use thin layers, I mean, just put 3 or 4 layers of paper mache on there, a thin layer of paper mache clay if that's what you're using. Make sure it dries really fast. Seal it as soon as it's totally dry so that air can't get, the water from the air can't get in. Your sculpture will last just as long as those antiques do, and they'll be treasured forever, I promise. So that's it. That's all I want to say about mold. If you have any questions about it, let me know. Or if you want to show off any of your projects, please come on over, ultimatepapermache.com. I'll see you there.